This is the eHealth Radio Network, your source for health advice on demand. And now your host, Eric Michaels.
Thanks for joining us once again here on the eHealth Radio Network. This is your host, Eric Michaels. eHealth Radio gives you the most current health information, news, and advice featuring some of the leading innovators in healthcare and wellness who are changing healthcare as we know it. For more eHealth Radio reports, we invite you to visit our main radio channel site at eHealthRadioNetwork.com. Today we're speaking with Dr. Waqas Al-Siddiq. He is the CEO and founder of Biotricity. He is recognized as a leader and innovator in the healthcare space, frequently speaking and publishing on thought-provoking topics in healthcare such as AI and the democratization of quality medical care. And Dr. Al-Siddiq, we thank you for joining us here today.
No, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
You're more than welcome. Looking forward to learning a few things from you here today, which is so important about our health. So why should listeners even take a moment to think about their heart health, especially those who don't have a known history of heart disease? Let's start there.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, that's a loaded question. So let me try to unpack that a little bit. And I think that most of us know that, but we don't really think about it. But heart disease is the number one killer in not only the United States, but every country in the world. I mean, somebody dies of a heart issue. I think the statistic is something like every 34 seconds. And the reality is that it happens because you don't really deteriorate. You know, like in cancer, you deteriorate. You see this, the health deteriorate in a person. You see them move slower. You see hair fall out. So there's these physical manifestations that we can, kind of grab to, cringe to, and it allows us to kind of come together and support our loved ones, right? Versus in heart health, it's sporadic, it's intermittent, it happens randomly. 20% of heart attacks are silent. You have no symptom, no indication, and it just occurs. And that's why they call it the silent killer. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we don't think about it. But if you ask the person the right question, pretty much everybody will answer if asked, do you know anybody who's had a heart issue or a heart condition in your family or friends? And everybody's like, yeah, within 1 or 2 degrees of separation, they know somebody who's had a heart attack, who's had a stroke, who's had a cardiac issue. And yet we're not really talking. And I think that the reason is just because these things don't present themselves in a physical way, and they happen sporadically. And so it's not top of mind.
Really do appreciate the lead off here, and I'm sure you've grabbed the attention of the audience, no doubt, with all these great points you've made here to get us underway here today. Now, tell me, why is heart disease still the number one killer in the world with all the technology and resources that we have access to?
This is another great question. So if we, go a little bit back to what I was saying earlier, because this is intermittent and asymptomatic, right? So people aren't feeling, right? They're going to bed, they're feeling fine. They might feel a little bit off, right? They say, hey, you know what, I'm going to sleep, and they have a heart attack while they're sleeping, right? And because of that nature of, by the time you feel the symptom, you go to the ER, you have no symptom anymore. And so the result is that you need long-term data collection, right? And that is essentially the challenge. So we have all of this technology, we have all of this information available, but we don't have long-term monitoring, right? We've got all these smartwatches, which are fantastic tools, and they're great if you're a symptomatic individual, but most people are asymptomatic. They're not feeling the symptoms. So you don't know when to check your data on your watch. You're thinking that everything's fine because you're not feeling something. And in order to actually identify and diagnose something, you need long-term data. And what do I mean by long-term data? I mean, if you and I were having this conversation, I had a symptom, I'd go to the ER, I'd get a referral, or I'd go to my internist saying I'm not feeling well. They would give me a referral to a cardiologist. It's going to take me, let's say, 30 days to get an appointment with the cardiologist. Then when I go to the cardiologist, they'll slap me on a device. That device will record my ECG for 10 days, 24 hours a day, right? 240 hours of data, right? And, I talked about about our watches. Our watches collect 30 seconds of ECG data. So 30 seconds of ECG data versus 240 hours of ECG data. And if I get 240 hours of data on my heart, the chance of me figuring out what is going on with my heart is 60%, not even 90%, 60%. So that's how hard it is to detect it, right? And then after that 10 days, so remember, I'm day 30 to get to the cardiologist, day 40 to complete my results, and then probably another week for analysis before I have to go back to the doctor. So you're looking at 45 to 60-day journey to figure out what is going on with my heart. And by the way, at any time in this window, something can happen to me. So the challenge as to why it's still the number one issue with all our technology and resources, one is this issue of the amount of information that we have to collect on an individual to figure out what's going on. The second issue is just accessibility, right? There's 30,000 cardiologists in America, and there's over 120 million people with at least one cardiac risk factor. So accessibility is a big issue, right? Do you have access to a cardiologist? How quickly can you get access to a cardiologist? And then I think the third piece is this issue that we talked about in our first question, which is just awareness, right? And what is standard of care? A crazy fact I was reading was that the number one killer of new moms is heart issues. I would have never guessed it. Number one killer of new moms. And apparently 50% of women are going into pregnancy with suboptimal heart health. And they are their basic blood work, their depression is checked, their other numbers are checked, but they don't get a heart screening. So, these are some of the things where awareness, I think, is another factor. And we talked about that, is how do we get that awareness? Because there is no outward physical manifestation of the deterioration.
Now let's look at wearables. We have so many digital health wearables. Why can't we just use them to figure out our heart health? Get into some of the details per your perspective.
Another great area to kind of explore, I touched on it a little bit when I was talking about, watches and how they collect 30 seconds of ECG. So when you talk about watches or smartwatches, there's two ways for them to collect data. There's a manual data, right? If we can manually wear the device and we manually hold it, I don't know if you've ever used one, but you can hold the watch with your opposite hand and you can collect your ECG for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, compared to 240 hours of data, right? In order to diagnose a patient from a cardiologist. So nobody's going to hold their watch for 240 hours without stopping. So that's a challenge, and especially because a lot of heart issues happen while you're sleeping or in the early mornings where you're not wearing the watch. Now, there's the other aspect of the watch, my watch is giving me my heart rate. What about that? Well, the heart rate is actually not collected with your ECG. It's collected through an optical sensor, which is basically looking at light. It looks at whether or not your blood has oxygen or not oxygen, right? So it's actually looking at oxygen within your blood. So that is not, and when we talk about heart attacks, right, and we talk about cardiac issues, a lot of these issues are caused by electrical issues. This is why the gold standard is to do an ECG. Well, getting heart rate from a pulse monitor, which is what your watch is doing without you having to manually touch it, that's a pulse rate. That is not a diagnosis for electrical issues. And so we have this idea that smartwatches can help us. They're great if you're symptomatic. They're great as a leading indicator that, hey, maybe you should go in if you somehow happen to catch something. But the chances of really catching something is a very, very low percentage. So we really shouldn't count on it. We should use them as tools that are great indicators about of generally making good life choices and being healthy, more anecdotal. Or if we're symptomatic, we know we have a known issue, they can be a helpful tool for us to manage that condition. But outside of that, if we're expecting that to help us get a diagnosis, it's really not the right instrument. It's a very blunt instrument for that purpose.
Really do appreciate all the information shared so far here today. So important when it comes to our heart health. We're speaking with Dr. Waqas Al-Siddiq, the CEO and founder of Biotricity, and he's joined us here today on eHealth Radio's Health News and Heart Health channels, a part of the eHealth Radio Network. Now, continuing on, one important factor I'd like to hear you talk about is preventative care. So discuss the importance of this.
Yeah, one of the stats I quoted earlier, where 20% of cardiac issues and heart attacks are totally silent, right? That is really where can we prevent those, right? They say 80% of heart attack and strokes, according to the American Heart Association, are preventable just through lifestyle modifications. The problem is, do we make that lifestyle modification when we're in the hospital, when we're in the ER, or can we make it earlier? And I think prevention is really about learning as early as possible whether or not, if you have a risk factor or you have an issue, how you can impact that, right? And how can you avoid that? I'll give you a perfect example. My parents are both diabetics, and which also increases, your risk for heart issues. Standard of care is not to get heart screenings on them. Standard of care is to just put them on aspirin. So it's like, why not get a cardiac screening as opposed to putting on aspirin? But a more personal story is I was uh, pre-diabetic about 4 years ago, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to become a diabetic. My parents are both diabetics. This is like a one-way path to diabetes, right? Unless I make certain changes. And I immediately adjusted, and I started making some, lifestyle changes, diet changes, and whatnot. And now I've got, 4 years later, I've got better glucose numbers and my A1C numbers than I've ever had in my since I was in my 20s. So, those are the things about prevention, right? Can you catch things early enough? And our whole thing is, if we think that we have a heart risk factor, and we know there's 120 million Americans that have a cardiac risk factor, that's pretty much one in, almost every two adults, right? Close to 50%. That means that we should, as a society, try to look at heart and diabetes. We talk about diabetes being the number one top five killers in the U.S. as well. So these are two areas that we should really try to screen ourselves on a proactive basis to look at that, because there's a lot of people that when they see the number, it's very, they'll act, right? Without seeing the number, they won't act, right? And I'll include myself in that statistic, right? Without seeing the fact that I was pre-diabetic, I didn't act before then, right? I acted when I got that confirmation. And I think that's the key on prevention, right? Can you proactively go in and get screenings and look at the areas that are the number one problem areas, or the top five problem areas in the US, and see how you can personally verify if you have that risk factor, and then B, look at where you are in terms of your stage, and C, go in and make changes to avoid that.
Now, taking this further, how does Biotricity's direct-to-consumer heart health screening service, HeartSecure, help users maintain their overall health through the preventative approach? Get into that a little bit.
That's a great question. I mean, that kind of happened, I would say, almost accidentally. As you know, Biotricity is a medical device company, and our core product is actually a prescription-based product that's used by cardiologists to screen patients. And our big claim to fame is that when you're wearing the device for that 10 days that I talked about, it's actually analyzing your ECG, and it can actually transmit it for emergencies, so that you're not held in the dark, right? Your data is available almost instantly, right? You're waiting 30 days to get onto the monitor, and then you have to wait another 15 days to get results. So we enable instantaneous results, and we also reduce patient risk by being able to transmit the data if we detect any anomalies. So what happened was, we got patients calling us, or maybe not patients, just individual people saying, hey, where can I get this device? I don't have a cardiologist within 2 hours of me. I want to get my heart screened. And so we kind of sat around the table and we said, look, I think that we've done a really good job as a company to make the technology available to cardiologists, but we haven't really made it available to the general public. And so we kind of sat in, and then we launched HeartSecure in response to this. And we said, okay, well, what if you don't have access to a cardiologist? Or what if you go to your internist and they're like, hey, all your risk factors are great, but you personally just want to check, right? You have a personal interest in prevention or longevity or heart health, and you want to get a check. Or you have these number one killer in college athletes is cardiac issues, right? So we've seen, NFL players drop of cardiac issues. So, and these people are screened all the time. So we said, okay, let us launch a direct-to-consumer product where we are able to access the cardiology network of our existing customers and have them review that data. So you may not have access to a cardiologist, Eric, but you can now order HeartSecure, get the information, and one of Biotricity's cardiologists who are using our technology somewhere in the United States can review those results and give you a report and an analysis that you can then either act on or take to your physician. So we wanted to solve that problem we talked about earlier about accessibility, right? Do you have access to a cardiologist? Or if you have access to a cardiologist, how long do you have to wait? And how can we make it cost effective enough? So the other focus was to make it cheap enough that whether you're going in to your internist, paying a copay, then waiting for your appointment, then paying a copay with your cardiologist and the visit fee and the parking and all of that, we wanted to make the entire process of the HeartSecure to get a full cardiac test done on your heart the same cost as it would if you had gone through the hurdles, but really to deal with the issue of those individuals that don't have access to cardiologists, right? That are maybe 1 or 2 hours away, or those that are just interested in doing a preventative screening. So that's where HeartSecure came from. That was the birth of the idea. It actually came from individuals, the general public, and now we have launched that. And so now you can order that and get a complete cardiac workup in terms of a cardiac test at your home, the same that you would get if you went to a cardiologist and they prescribe. So we're mimicking that exact experience, but now it's available directly to you, as opposed to having to wait 30 days to get in front of a cardiologist.
That is absolutely phenomenal. What a service. And again, we thank you on behalf of Biotricity for that. Lastly, as we conclude, healthcare accessibility remains a prominent issue within the U.S. today. How does HeartSecure address the issue of healthcare accessibility and the disparities there?
That is one of the challenges, and I think we talked about that earlier, right? There's just not enough cardiologists. There's too many patients. So one of the things that we really try to deal with, this is where we launched HeartSecure, right? How can we make this available and accessible? How can we make it cheap enough, right, that it is affordable for everybody to go in and do this, once a year or once every couple of years? You can use it as a Christmas gift, but more importantly, it's saving time, it's saving energy, and it's, from a costing perspective, it's affordable enough, and you're giving access to cardiologists, right? Because if you're in 1 hour away from a cardiologist, or 2 hours away from a cardiologist, your access is really not there. So unless you're really going to have a major event, you're probably not going to see that cardiologist. But the way we try to deal with that accessibility was to launch this direct-to-consumer way. And so to do that, we're directly trying to deal with this issue, because now you have access to a cardiologist because they'll read your data. And so I think that this concept of access, right? And there's a lot of now new companies coming out with home-based blood tests where you can prick your finger down and do your blood and get all your lipid profiles and all. And it's cheap enough that when you compare it to the time and the how much money you're going to spend on gas, you really can bring it and do it at home. So a lot of these home-based and direct to consumer offerings in healthcare are going to really deal with this accessibility issue. And that's where we saw that trend, and that's why we, responded to it, right? And I'll be honest, we didn't respond to it in the beginning. We were always trying to deal with healthcare accessibility by enabling the provider, by enabling the cardiologist, by enabling the hospital. And we saw this trend, and then we got the phone calls in where there are companies out there that are enabling the individuals themselves, right, to do things from a health perspective through the comfort of their own homes. And so we did the same thing. So that's how we're trying to really focus on accessibility, right? Enable the provider and enable the individual. And that's our focus at the company, and that's what we're thinking about with every product that we launch.
Dr. Al-Siddiq, again, we want to thank you for taking a moment to be with us here today and for all the insight and information shared. Certainly eye-opening and certainly an important topic, no doubt. If listeners wanted to get more information on Biotricity, where's the best place online to do so?
Absolutely. You can get to us at our website, www.biotricity.com. That's BIOTRICITY.com. All of our products are available there, and you can also reach out to us through our socials. We're on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and we are always accessible.
And of course, listeners, as always, draw your attention to the show notes where you can also pick up this link and other details as well. Again, Dr. Al-Siddiq, all the best, and thanks so much for joining us here today on eHealth Radio.
Thank you.
Again, we've been speaking with Dr. Waqas Al-Siddiq, the CEO and founder of Biotricity, and for all the details, once again, visit biotricity.com. eHealthRadioNetwork.com. And again, this has been your host, Eric Michaels, and we do thank you for your continued support of the eHealth Radio Network. Join us again soon for another episode that will help further expand your knowledge on those things that are important to your health and wellness. For more eHealth Radio reports, we invite you to visit our main radio channel site at eHealthRadioNetwork.com. And as always, we do thank you for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to the eHealth Radio Network. For more information or to subscribe to this podcast, visit eHealthRadioNetwork.com.